In my last video, I discussed Ubisoft's plan to support Ghost Recon Wildlands after its launch. I talked about the game's Season Pass, which, based on its listing in the Wildlands and Steam stores, is set at $39.99 US, and criticized Ubisoft for including microtransactions on top of paid DLC. I also opined that the premise behind the second piece of DLC, Fallen Ghosts, sounded more enticing and more exciting than the actual main story of Wildlands. However, there was one big piece of information I left out because I wanted to talk about it in a separate video. Ubisoft also announced that in a free update coming a few months after launch, Wildlands would be introducing competitive multiplayer. I think it's going to be a disaster, and I would like to take a few minutes to talk about why. During the beta periods, many people were asking whether Wildlands would have PvP multiplayer. That's a reasonable question, I feel, as competitive multiplayer is a part of many major games, such as Halo, Rainbow Six, Splinter Cell, Battlefield, Call of Duty, For Honor, and now since Future Soldier, Ghost Recon. However, the difference is that big titles like Halo 5, Rainbow Six Siege, and Battlefield 1, to name a few, are designed with competitive multiplayer in mind. They are built from the ground up to feature those elements. Ghost Recon Wildlands, however, is clearly not. Otherwise, it would have been included at launch. Yet, if it was supposed to be included at launch, then we can say certainly that the game was not actually finished when it was released. The first problem I see with competitive multiplayer in Ghost Recon Wildlands is that most of the environments crafted by Ubisoft are really not conducive to that kind of gameplay. There are a lot of wide open spaces with little to no cover, and then plenty of tiny outposts, some larger bases, and a few large towns, but these are clearly designed for PvE, not PvP. If you look at multiplayer in Future Soldier, for example, or the Rainbow Six Vegas games, or Rainbow Six Siege, you see maps that are crafted very specifically with cover, flanking routes, areas to hide or set up ambushes, but Wildlands doesn't really have any of that. The way the game is set up is for you, the player, to have approach routes to move and fight against AI that has scripted patrols or stands in scripted places. The instant you replace that with human players who act like, well, humans, it's going to turn into a snorefest where whichever team gets the high ground first or gets to cover first is going to be victorious almost every time. The second problem is that it will be limited to 2 teams of 4. This is going to work best with very small play areas, which Rainbow Six Siege handled perfectly, but Wildlands doesn't really have any locations for that kind of gameplay. Yet if you make the gameplay area too large, games are going to last too long because players won't be able to find each other. Whereas Siege's 5-on-5 multiplayer works perfectly within that game's structure, Wildlands multiplayer will surely feel small, slow, and empty. Player characters lack the speed of those in Call of Duty, and even though that game is only 6-on-6, players move so quickly that they're almost always in a fight. The potential game areas for Wildlands multiplayer matches to take place in lack the depth and strategic possibilities of other multiplayer-centric games, like for example Battlefield 1. And that might be an unfair comparison because Battlefield's smallest game mode is still 12 versus 12, even in reasonably small areas. The third problem I see with Wildlands multiplayer is that gunplay is not particularly exciting. These elite operators have apparently never performed a reload before because it takes them forever. Bullets travel excruciatingly slowly and have an unnaturally steep bullet drop, so you can pretty much forget about any kind of exciting long-range sniper rifle engagements. You can't forget about the time it takes to switch to first person for aiming. In a battle between someone who aims down sights versus someone who aims over the shoulder, the person who aims over the shoulder will almost certainly win every time unless Ubisoft incorporates some wild bullet deviation to make their quicker, easier target acquisition less accurate. Something like Rainbow Six Siege works well with slower-paced multiplayer because its focus is on tactics, and the multiplayer maps are so confined that there are multiple ways to attack or defend, but again, Wildlands doesn't have that. My fourth concern is balance. There are a lot of weapons in Wildlands, more than in Future Soldier, and given that all of them are a one-hit kill on an unaware enemy or 2 or 3 shots on an unarmored enemy in its combat state, I don't really see how Ubisoft can balance the game for multiplayer. Obviously, the player can take more hits than your average AI enemy, but how will more powerful late-game weapons be balanced against those who are just starting out? And speaking of late game, how will Ubisoft balance those who have spent skill points in things like, for example, increased resistance to bullet damage? The only way I can see this multiplayer really working is if it's entirely separate from the main game, with its own pacing, its own weapons handling, its own skill trees, and its own ranking system. But then the issue is that it probably wouldn't feel like Wildlands. It would feel like a different game tacked on. And to be honest, that disconnect between looking like the same game but playing almost entirely differently is one of the problems that plagued Future Soldier. Ghost Recon isn't supposed to be a fast-paced shooter, yet Wildlands multiplayer would almost inevitably try to accomplish that. Unlike Splinter Cell, which has the awesome balance of stealthy spies with little to no health fighting heavily armed and armored mercenaries, or Rainbow Six, which has a nice push-pull dynamic of tense preparation and intense gunfights, or For Honor, which has large-scale battles against enemy AI coupled with intense one-on-one fights against other players, Wildlands PvP will probably be disappointing. Are you looking forward to Wildlands competitive multiplayer? Do you think you'd stick to cooperative multiplayer instead? Or do you just like to go solo? Let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, please click on that like button. For more information about Ghost Recon Wildlands, as well as other previews, reviews, commentary, and critiques, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.